I'm Haleh Spandiari, and I run the Middle East program. I would like to welcome you all to today's meeting on sanctions relief, Iran's economic and monetary policy options. Could Iran's policies of the 60s and 70s be a guide or a lesson? We are very fortunate to have with us today Hassan Ali Mehran to my left, the former governor of the Central Bank of Iran and the author of the book, The Goals and Policies of the Central Bank of Iran, 1960 to 1978. Those of you who read Persian can buy the book at the end of the meeting. And to my right, Hadi Salehi Esfahani, professor of Economic University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And to my far left, Susan Maloney, senior fellow, foreign policy at Saban Center of the Middle East Policy Brookings at Brookings. Suzanne has spoken here at the Wilson Center a number of times, and we consider her part of us. So, and she has been always very gracious. Every time I turn to her, she accepts our invitation and comes. But Hadi is here for the first time, and we hope that we will be welcoming you many, many times. And of course, we are very thankful to Mr. Mehran, who has accepted our invitation to join us as a speaker. I must say it took me almost a decade to convince him to move from that side of the room to this side of the room. But we even took his son, kept his son as a hostage for a year. He was our intern, but even he could not convince the papa to sit here. For the sake of time, we have circulated the bios of the panelists, and the way we are going to run this meeting is that Hadi will go first, followed by Suzanne, and they will both discuss the current economic situation and the effect of the sanctions. And I'm sure if they have time, they might be touch on whether this latest agreement between the P5+1 and Iran that led to Iran having access to a minuscule amount of 7 billion of its own currency, whether it will make any difference in the current economic situation in Iran. Mr. Mehran will be our third speaker, and he will probably look back to the 60s and 70s and will talk about whether some of the measures taken then can be used as a guide to help or save the Iranian economy from its current malaise. We have another former central bank governor of Iran in the audience, so we are very welcome, very happy to have him too. And also the chairman and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center just walked in, Jane Harman, and she's very interested in all the international issues, but Iran has a special place with her. With that, Hadi, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. Quite honored to be here, especially with Dr. Mehran and Susan Maloney on the panel. I plan to say a few words about what the situation is, and hopefully that will set the ground for the discussion of the comparison between now and what happened before the revolution, what lessons can we learn from those periods, and what can be done right now. I'll be talking briefly about sanctions, but Suzanne is the expert on this, so I'll delegate that to her. Now, in a few words, if we want to describe the situation of the economy in Iran, is stagflation, negative growth, inflation very high. And the cause of this is bad policy making. That's pretty simple. There's no, one can say that sanctions have had an impact. Yes, they've had, but if you think about that, that's also bad policy making. And some of what has happened even with the sanction should not have happened. So the question becomes what went wrong and what can be done right now to fix the problem. The heart of the problem in Iran is there are two things. One is basically it's an issue of politics and the structure of the political system that leads to poor policy making, at least in the past. Louder, sure. One problem is the political structure that gives rise to bad policy making. The way the system is set up, decisions are made. And in some ways, there are parallels with the situation before the revolution, and there's also some clear differences. The second issue is what in economics we call fiscal dominance. It means that basically central bank becomes more or less irrelevant. What the outcome is largely determined in the government and in the executive branch. In Iran, there's a sort of super executive branch as well that also influences the outcome. The decision making in that branch, when it has problems, it actually causes not only difficulties with economic growth in terms of allocation of resources, etc., but also it can create very high inflation. What went wrong over the past several years was there was a populist president came to office, and very similar to some of what happened before the revolution, the Shah deciding that I can do a lot with the oil money. Here was oil money coming in, and the president decided that he can do a lot. The specific projects they got into were different. The Shah was investing in petrochemicals and had other designs. Ahmadinejad has his own program, and convinced also the supreme leader that this is the way to proceed, and it's going to be serving our constituency, and everybody's going to be very happy, and the economy is going to be booming very soon. But what they were trying to do largely was to defy laws of economics, just ignore constraints. And of course, a lot of economists, people who are more knowledgeable about how the system works, might be complaining, but they're easily dismissed by saying, hey, you're academic, you don't know what's going on. Look, we're spending here and everything is going very well. And just, for example, let me give you a concrete example now, which has also counterparts in the past. Housing is short, house prices are going up, so we're going to be building a lot of houses to lower the price, especially for the poor. So this was the Maskan Mehr project, which started several years ago. Now, when you're building these buildings, you do create jobs, you do spend, but there's no supply. These houses take time to mature. So meanwhile, the demand is being stimulated. There's no supply coming forward to match it. As a result, that could cause inflation in the entire economy, because everybody who's getting paid, all the companies that are working on this project, are taking their money and spending it. And if you don't pay them, of course, there are consequences for that too. It becomes difficult to operate. They also, based on the expectations that they will be paid, they will start spending. So this creates inflation in the rest of the economy while the project is being built. On top of that, because the government is running this, this was not something selected in response to a market demand. A lot of times there are misallocations. So you don't get the same bang for the buck that you would get if the private sector is responding to demand. The result of it is that even if some years later the projects are built, it's not going to quite provide the same service that would have been provided if the money had gone through the market. And achieved similar result. But the government thinks it can do better than everybody else. It also serves some purposes because there are these construction companies that belong to the powers that be, so they want jobs. And if you can come up with this great project, they can get the contracts, build these buildings, and then you're serving the poor. So you're serving two purposes at the same time. It looks great and everybody's agreed upon at the top, but the actual economics of it means that there's going to be a huge deficit because government is going to be spending without earning much from it. So that was one project, for example, which Dr. Mehran probably is going to give you a very similar parallel project with a different name, with a different location, etc., from before the revolution. These types of projects, the politicians deciding that they can do it and they don't need to obey the constraints of the economy, leads to crises. And sometimes they may even know, but their view is that let's do it quickly, and by the time we see the inflation or we see the problems emerging, we're going to be in a different era. In the case of a president, the president might think that, or I'm going to be out of office, somebody else is going to be taking care of this. So they proceed with their projects, and because of fiscal dominance, meaning that the fiscal policy is running the show, the deficit turns into huge money supply, huge demand in the economy, and creates inflation. And inflation by itself then starts having adverse effects. To deal with inflation, you need to make a recession, create a recession, and that's where the economy is right now. The other big project that they started, and right now is being debated whether to be continued or not, Maskan Mer is a key issue right now that the current government is trying to deal with. What to do with it? It's half done. Should they finish it? Should they not finish it? If they continue, it's going to be running a deficit. If they stop it, a lot of unhappy groups are going to be out there, and the money that has been spent is going to go to waste. So it's not an easy issue, and the current budget that the president of Iran this week submitted to the parliament tried to sort of sidestep. For now, let's just continue, but we're going to be deciding on it very soon. The second project that was highly inflationary was the subsidy reform. A great idea to make sure that energy prices reflect international prices, because in Iran, they were 1/10 of international prices. So it made a lot of sense to implement the project, raise energy prices, get some cash, and in order to make everybody happy, agree with it, we're just going to be redistributing the cash equally to everybody. Now, there was a lot of debate whether only the lower strata of the society should get it or not. Eventually, they decided to give it to everybody because it's so difficult to determine who's poor, who's not. So they did it. The problem was this. When they calculated how much money they can raise by raising energy prices, and therefore how much cash they're going to have, there was a mistake of about order of 4 times. They just overestimated how much cash they can get, and maybe they knew, maybe they didn't, but there were a lot of calculations before they did the policy reform that the amount that they should pay should be much more limited. But in order to make it look really nice and we're helping the poor, the amount that they distributed was basically doubled the income of the households in the bottom 20% or so, about 15%, up to about 15%. Your income would be doubled when you got the subsidy, which is just huge. And this money being distributed to everybody else, it looked great initially. But then, because of the deficit it created, they had to take credit from the central bank. That additional money created inflation. The value of that cash subsidy right now is 1/3 of what it was 3 years ago. So in a sense, the problem is being solved, but still, the budget for this cash subsidy is much bigger than the budget for the entire educational system of Iran. And they realize it. This is being debated in the newspaper. This is sort of matter of TV discussion, etc., what to do about this. But it's become a difficult sticking issue of how to solve this problem. And meanwhile, they fixed the nominal prices of energy. So we're basically back where we were before, because all other prices have gone up 2-3 times, and prices of energy for the past 3 years have been fixed. So we're getting close to where we were before. So let me just finish that by saying that these things would have created a lot of inflation and stagnation anyway. On top of this, the sanctions came and just made the matter a lot worse last year. And right now, there are debates of how to deal with this. The sanctions are being solved in some way. At least what we see is hope in Iran, amazing hope that the amount is small of the cash being released by the agreement, but the hope is great, and hopefully that will solve a lot of problems.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hadi, for sticking just to your 10 minutes. Thanks. Suzanne?
Thank you very much to Hale Esfandiari and to the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting me here with such a learned panel. And for that reason, I will try to bridge the presentations between past and present, but also try to keep my remarks very strictly within the 10-minute limit so that I give plenty of time for conversation and for questions. Let me just try to situate Iran and the Iranian economy in a very broad and enforcedly superficial fashion. I'll just start by sort of reminding this room, although I'm sure many, if not most of those in this room need no reminder, that Iran is this incredibly wealthy country whose history we've just managed to find overshadowed by the nuclear crisis. We know this, of course, from the experience of the 1960s and 70s, when Iran was the China of the era. It was growing at a rate effectively twice of that of other middle-income countries, about 9.8%, the sort of epic rates that we've seen from China in recent years. The non-oil sector was growing faster than any other part of the economy for much of the 60s, and much of the growth, much of the really incredible progress of the Iranian economy actually predated the oil boom of the 71 and 73. All of what we know of the Iranian economy, in fact, dates from that era, including the auto sector, which is, of course, one of the focuses of sanctions today. There were massive improvements, expansions in the oil and gas sector, the historic gas export deal to the Soviet Union, the achievement of full national control over production and pricing of the oil sector, and a host of other non-economic factors that I think played into this tremendous growth and the success story that Iran was prior to the mid-1970s. The non-economic factors that Hale and others can speak to far better than I can, the expansion of education and literacy, and the entrance of women into both political and economic spheres, which were very crucial, I think, to the story of Iran prior to the revolution. We all know, of course, the problems, the bottlenecks, the inflation, the overspending that in fact helped to crash in the economy, and then the oil issues of the mid to late 1970s, which contributed. The uneven growth, the corruption, the growing income inequality, high consumption and import levels of the 1970s, all of which helped facilitate the conditions which enabled the political entrepreneurs, the dissidents to come together in a way and articulate what I've argued in a book that will be published soon, a message of revolutionary change that was very much grounded in a change in the economy. Of course, we didn't see the Islamic Republic make the sort of dramatic changes. There was a lot of restructuring, a lot of shifting of resources. But in effect, Iran remained after the revolution facing similar challenges that it did in the 1960s and 70s. I would argue that the crisis that Iran is facing today in terms of the economy is in fact a louder and stronger echo of prior economic crises that the Islamic Republic has faced on at least 3 occasions. In 1984, 1985, when the price of oil dipped and the burdens of the war and of the social spending after the revolution became too large, too difficult for the Islamic Republic to bear. 1993, 94, when the post-war boom in imports and consumption contributed to a debt crisis that again forced a retrenchment. And then again in the late 1990s, just after President Khatami came into office, in part because of the Asian economic crises. On each of these occasions, the Islamic Republic dealt with what were, in fact, severe economic crises, existential economic crises, at least in the case of 84 and in 93, through a couple of different mechanisms. One was an attempt to establish austerity programs, cut back on spending. Two was an attempt to improve revenue collection, expand the tax base, and also attract greater foreign investment. And three, if not deliberately, but in fact to help facilitate parts one and parts two of the response to economic crises, were a series of both social and political reforms that we saw toward the end of the war, that we saw again as part of the reconstruction program that President Rafsanjani launched and intensified after the debt crisis in 1993, and that of course accompanied the presidency of Mohammad Khatami. There's a kind of integral link between the economic conditions and precipitants and what happened in the way of the expansion of social and political activism in each of these periods. But there was also a pushback, and I think that some of what Dr. Saleh Isfahani spoke to will begin to give you a sense of what we will likely see in response to President Rouhani's budget, what we've already seen in the resignation of some parliamentarians. Austerity doesn't go over well with any Congress, with any elected official. And this has been a kind of persistent issue in Iran. We've seen, in fact, that this is ideologically difficult, has been ideologically difficult in the past. It was a subject of some of the most intense battles within the Islamic Republic, far more intense than over the nuclear issue in the 1980s, about whether or not we can, in fact, retrench social spending. And of course, the attempts to expand the tax base, to actually collect on the taxes that do exist, as well as to increase prices to market levels for energy and for other basic goods, also prove socially and politically contentious. And so in each of these cases, in the 80s, in the early 90s, we saw really an intense political battle within the regime itself over how to affect these policies. In each of these prior cases, in fact, Iran managed to muddle through. But the difference between today and those periods, I would argue, is the sanctions. In the past, in particular in 93 and again in 97, Tehran's, in fact, tried to mitigate some of the domestic economic pressures by seeking more foreign investment, particularly in the oil and gas sector. We've seen little signs of this in the sense that the new oil minister, who is, of course, the old oil minister, Bijan Zanganeh, who's someone who's clearly identified as the most strident pro-market reformer in the sector, has already been out, really beating the drum for the return of Western investors to the sector. But the sanctions remain, I would argue, a really intense impediment. Let me just say a few words on the sanctions relief package and then turn it over to the real star of the show here, and look forward to the questions. I think that the administration is quite correct when they have been describing consistently the package that was offered in Geneva as a modest one. I think it's almost impossible to argue with it, although we've certainly seen some have sought to do so. I was, in fact, stunned that the Iranians were willing to accept such a relatively paltry amount, both in terms of the funds and in terms of the facilitation of new business. Effectively, the ability, the 6-month waiver for petrochemicals, the auto sector, and for gold and other precious metals is really not a shot in the arm to the Iranian economy at this point. In fact, it may, I would argue, complicate the predicament of the Iranian economy, because liquidity is not, in fact, the major demand of Iran. Iran has tremendous assets, tremendous wealth locked within the country. The difficulty, of course, is with the structure of the economy, and with doing business abroad, the fact that Iranians can't get letters of credit, that they can't engage in simple trade, remains very much the case. And so whatever additional revenues may accrue to the government and to semi-governmental enterprises, including the Revolutionary Guard, as a result of these new sanctions is paltry, and it will do little to affect the overall competitiveness of the economy until and unless the sort of structural issues can be addressed, and until and unless the broader impediments to doing business abroad. The other issues I think that are just important to mention is that enforcement is going to remain at a really high pitch. That's sort of stating the obvious given the news yesterday and given the news just a few weeks ago about Weatherford International. But clearly the administration's primary audience on Iran right now is not in Tehran, it's on the Hill. And they want to make clear that the sanctions that remain in place will be enforced in an absolutely severe fashion. And I think that will occur despite the dissatisfaction of the Iranian interlocutors and of our other partners in the P5+1 who've complained about it. The numbers that have been thrown around by some about 20, this is really 20 or 40 billion, that in fact the auto sector is going to boom, are totally illusory. I mean, you can read the Iranian press and you can pluck numbers out of the sky, and I'm sure we've all done it on occasion. But in effect, the Iranian auto sector is really a domestic industry for all intents and purposes, very, very modest exports, even at its height. And production has crashed as a result of the sanctions. It will probably be reestablished, but most of those cars are still destined for the domestic market. So, the idea that there's going to be a massive foreign exchange influx as a result of any of these measures, and we can go into the same details with respect to gold and petrochemicals, I think is a political case, not an economic case. Finally, let me just say that I think the structure of the deal is one that the United States and its allies ought to be trumpeting and defending, because really, this is a deferred compensation deal. Iran's real reward comes at the end of the rainbow, when and if a final nuclear deal has been struck. Even then, I expect most US sanctions to remain in place, but that's when European companies, when the rest of the world can flood back to the Iranian marketplace. And that's a good thing, because we want a final deal. The Iranians appear to want a final deal, and the incentive is really there for one. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hassan Ali, you have the...
Thank you very much, Arjun, for inviting me today. As you mentioned, it's taken me 20 years to cross the room to the high table, but I very much look forward to my immediate return to the backbenchers, which are much more comforting. Listening to Susan and Hadi, I'd like to, if I may, take a couple of minutes to put the commonality, if you like, or that element which continues in the history of Iran, both politically and economically in the last 100 years or so. When you look at the literature on Iran, economy or political science of it, you will find that given the nature of the rupture in 1979 and the revolution, most of the literature which at least I am familiar with either deals with before or after. And the before is often dealing with matters or causes which led to the revolution, and after, of course, studies the structure of the Islamic Republic, its management of the economy, and quite a bit of Islamic economics in the context of it. But I have seen very little studies, but I will mention a couple of them in a minute, which go back and look at Iran for the last 100 years or so. And because both speakers mentioned it, I'd like to mention to you a major marker in Iran's politics and economics happened on May 28, 1908, 2 years after the Constitutional Revolution. It happened in a very remote, barren area of Iran called Masjid Suleiman. And it was witnessed by Colonel Wilson, who was commanding an Indian regiment to protect the oil lines from the Bakhtiari attacks. That also gives you a little flavor of Iran of those days. And according to him, the liquid oil, the black gold, came up to the height of 50 feet or so, having successfully drilled the first oil well in Iran at the depths of 1,100 feet. Iran's economy and politics has never been the same again since then. If you look at the politics of Iran since then, you will find that the very word of concession, which is normally what you give to a foreign investment company to exploit your resources, has a connotation of conceding. And psychologically, Iran has been trying to deal with that psychology ever since, that the foreigners are exploiting the resources of Iran, the main sources of Iran, that is oil. And therefore, it led, as you know, in 1951, to the nationalization of the oil industry, subsequently to trying to manage as much of the oil industry as possible in the 1973 agreement. And even the Shah, in his book, Answer to History, talks about the oil companies as the reason for his departure. I've read also a couple of books about the oil, the king of oils, but I would have liked to think that there will be a new book called The Oil is the King. Hadi mentioned, and I think in the economic jargon, this is the very essence of our success. It's also the very essence of our predicaments. How to manage oil. In simple terms, if you want to know what happens to any highly populated, developing country in the Middle East who is oil producing, if you want to know how they're doing, ask them, what did you do with your oil money? If they've done well with that, they've done well. If they haven't done well, they've had problems. In a more recent study that Hadi himself has been party to and done quite a bit of work on this, but I like to refer to a paper by Pesaran and Muhaddis, December 2012. 100 years of oil money, a curse or a blessing. The title itself reminds me of my times as a student in Iran in 1950s, as a student at high school. A man called Abul Fazl al-Lisani first started a series of articles in Dad newspaper and eventually put it in a form of a book, which came out in 1952, called Talay Siyah ya Balay Iran, the black gold or the curse of Iran. And when I read the word the curse in an academic paper or a blessing, it reminded me that indeed we are still haunted by and trying to address the very issue that has been in our economic and political history for so many years. But according to this study, let me give you, if I may, a few figures, and that sums up my first part of the presentation. From 1937 to 2010, the real GDP growth was 4.96% in Iran, and inflation 12.69%. If you split this period from 1960 to 1978, which is the subject of my book, real GDP growth was 8.3%, inflation 6.18%. After the rupture, from 1979 to 2010, real GDP growth 2.42%, inflation 17.18%. These are, of course, figures to ponder, that namely, as Hadi himself has shown in one of his recent papers, that even though it may be a curse or abundance theory of economics, in that the absorptive capacity will not allow us to spend oil money wisely, in fact, through increasing our capital capacity to grow and capital accumulation in the economy, it has a permanent long-term impact on the growth of the economy, as shown in these figures. But where does the curse come from? As an ex-central banker, I tell you what happens, at least from my perspective in my time. This is what happened. In 1973, we quadrupled the income from oil. The budget was multiplied 4 times in terms of resources. The immediate impact of that is that the expenditure will also go up, not necessarily first year as much as 4 times, but it certainly doubled in 1974. The magic of the numbers is that the following year, the income will not quadruple again. But you have created a momentum into the economy, injected so much in terms of starting projects that the expenditure itself cannot be controlled or reduced to the growth rate of income, which is down, say, now to 5 or 6 or 10%. Subsequently, you can manage for another year with another 30% or 40% growth of government expenditure, but eventually you get into a deficit situation. So this is the continuous element of our history. And you may ask, what is it that Norway could do in terms of management of its excess income, if you like, in forms of a sovereign fund and investing it overseas, whereas other countries cannot do? I mentioned this, that I emphasize that the high population economies of the Middle East cannot do it, but the smaller ones have been able to. When the population is very small, you can always have the luxury of being able not to spend your money. And Norway, being a highly industrialized country, has the luxury of saving the amount of income that it cannot absorb adequately or satisfactorily. But when you are a developing country, you have a lot of claims on the government. And these claims are met through budget expenditure. And therefore, in the words of one of our ministers at the time, there is no problem in Iran that money cannot solve. The problem is that that money, in fact, once it is put to every problem that you have, it increases your excess capacity. It absorbs all your excess capacity and begins to show and inject constraints throughout the economy, as we experienced it in 1978 in Iran and earlier, in terms of shortage of electricity, shortage of construction materials, shortage of ports, capacity to handle imports, etc. So much for the continuity. Where is the contrast? I think there are some differences. In that, in Iran of the 1960s and 70s, in my view, and I can be subject to correction here, there was much more emphasis on production. There was much more of a viable private sector, which had an engine of growth of its own to sustain itself. Of course, with support of the government, but not the manner in which it is so static here in Iran of the Islamic Republic, where in fact the private sector is a sort of a privatized government sector. We certainly did not open accounts at banks and put money in the pockets and the banking accounts of each individuals according to their names. While there was a fair element in the 60s and certainly in the 70s of distribution, but most emphasis was on production. I think that, as I see it, in the Islamic Republic, the concept of Beitul Mal, or the wealth of the nation, that the oil money offers the state is too tempting to resist. Therefore, you try to distribute it and put it, as the Minister Tayyip Nia of the current administration in Iran mentioned, to put the money, oil money, on the tables immediately without any process of production first. The nature of the system, therefore, becomes highly distributive rather than productive. In the words of, again, Hadi, and in economic jargons, one can conclude that everything to do with economic policy in Iran or countries similar to Iran is fiscal. So where does the central bank governor come into this? And where does the monetary policy come into this? Not very much, but there is room. As I notice again, in the 70s, and my friend and colleague, Mr. Shurako, is here to bear witness, we did have inflation in Iran far in excess of the amount of inflation that we experienced in the 60s. There is definitely a marker in Iran's economic development and performance in the 60s and the 70s. And what happened in between, of course, as you know, is fiscal and the government income from oil. But in the 70s, the difference was that the whole world was also in an inflation environment. All the industrialized countries, if you look at their average consumer prices, they were talking about double digits. Partly, of course, that was one reason that the oil prices went up in 73, 74, in order to accommodate Iran for the changes that had taken place in the price of imports from those industrialized countries. In the 70s, again, to give you a couple of figures from, from the time I became the governor, inflation went up to 16.6% in 1976 and went up again to 25.5% in 1977. But then it came down to 9.1%. It was, in my view, partly to do with the measures that we took in terms of monetary policy. Typically, monetary policy in a country like Iran, when the financial markets are not fully functional, relies much more on quantitative restrictions rather than on the price mechanism. You restrict the capacity of banks to lend. It's very easy to put a ceiling on it. Therefore, the price mechanism becomes secondary to it. But even there, we took a number of measures to increase the level of interest rates from 7.5% on one-year time deposits and 8% on the lending side to 12% and 14%. It did not compensate for the amount of inflation in the economy, but at least it was in the right direction. If I'm not mistaken, in the last administration in the Islamic Republic, it was reversed. At the time of high inflation, in fact, the level of interest rates came down. We also opted for a unified exchange rate. This is rather controversial. Once you have the money on the balance of payments on your current account, and it's a surplus, and yet you are in an inflationary situation, what do? Do you opt to devalue, or do you opt to revalue? If you are to have a balance of payments equilibrium, you should be revaluing. And there were, I tell you, quite a bit of pressure on the central bank at the time that it should actually revalue rial, and instead of 70 rials per dollar, we would then be selling it at 50 rials per dollar. And we, at the time, also had two separate markets, a commercial market and a non-commercial market. The idea was initially that we would have a freedom of capital movements, which would be captured through the non-commercial markets, and there the price would fluctuate. But in doing so, it would be, therefore, you would be going into a dual foreign exchange rates. In order to unify it, obviously the central bank as the main source of foreign exchange would be selling foreign exchange in the non-commercial market in order to unify the two rates. But having done so, then it remained at 70 reals at a time that the domestic inflation was very much above the world average. I recall, and it's in my little book, that I saw someone, it was reported to us, that had been buying foreign exchange a lot in Iran. So I knew the guy, and I called him on the phone. I said, "You've been buying dollars. Why do you need so much dollars?" He said, "It's because it's so cheap." I said, "But we haven't changed the rate." He said, "Yes, you have." I said, "How did you do that?" He said, "Because everything else has gone up. So if everything else goes up, that means the dollar has come down. So I buy it." It becomes a bargain. In that situation, it's, again, you have to think anew. If you, and here I think right now they have this problem in Iran. If you devalue the exchange rate or bring it to match the inflation differential between Iran and the rest of the world, you are in fact putting more money into the government budget through income from oil. And what does the government do with it? They spend it again. So you get into the spiral of inflation that you cannot maintain. Therefore, you can only have a full package of policies if you get the fiscal right. And if you lose the budget of the battle of the budget, then of course monetary policy becomes extremely secondary. I have a few comments about the corporate structure of the central bank, but I leave it in case somebody would ask, and then I address it then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have live webcasts, and I wouldn't be surprised that the people in Iran are watching and learning from the lessons that are given today. Before opening the floor, let me put a question to all three of you. How long will it take to push back the Iranian economy to the pre-Ahmadinejad period, to the last years of Khatami? Because according to Mr. Rouhani, I mean, Iran had the most income in the last 8 years, and never had the government be so much in debt to banks and other institutions. So let's start with that. And Hadi, let's start with you.
That's a good question, although let me actually, it needs some clarification. The economy's declined the past year or so, year and a half, but before that there was growth. So if you want to go back to before Ahmadinejad, in fact, the economy during Ahmadinejad for some time, it improved in some ways. There are difficulties in terms of government's deficit and indebtedness that's going to be difficult to fix, although the high inflation is kind of taking care of it because all the prices are going up and government's debt, past debt is vanishing automatically. So hopefully that will not happen in the United States to wipe out our savings. But that is partly what is happening there. So in that sense, because inflation by itself, it's a really bad thing, but could actually solve the problem also if it goes away. If somehow we can, within a year or so, the government can manage to bring down inflation to single digits, then the inflation is going to be under control. Meanwhile, the past inflation has taken care of some of those past debts. If the economy starts rebounding, and with the comments from Susan, I think I understand that the government of Iran is a little bit too optimistic about what's possible. But people in Iran are extremely optimistic at this point that with this current deal will turn into something more permanent, and money is going to flow in and the growth is going to resume. So within a year or so, we might see actually major rebound in the economy, lower inflation, and the government probably will be able to solve its deficit problem as well.
Hassan, within 1 year? Your experience from the
Well, if there is any bit of economics left in me, I would never predict with such precision and say that. But let me just draw, if I may, a little bit from Iran's 60s history here. And it's very easy to say that, I know, and Susan will, I'm sure, correct me, that it politically may not be feasible. But at least listening to the debate in Iran, they're quite aware of the fact that when you are in a situation of stagflation, that is, you have a combination of recession with high inflation, which in fact we did in 1959, you have to deal with the inflation first. Number one is much easier. All the studies that I'm aware of, and Hadi knows them far better than I do, there's a very high correlation between total amount of liquidity in the economy and amount of inflation. Any correlation equation that you look at, regression analysis that is, you'll find about 85% of the changes of consumer price index in an economy like Iran can be explained by the changes in total liquidity. And total liquidity, to the extent that fiscal is controlled, can be controlled by the central bank. Therefore, if you do that, and they already are seeing a reduction in the rate of change of inflation because the rate of change of liquidity is now decreasing in Iran. With that in mind, the stabilization program that Iran negotiated with the IMF back in 1960, and at that very time, the central bank, in fact, was born at the time of a recession, became the launching pad of growth for the next 10 years, sustained with very low inflation. And it seems to me that, in fact, the magic of numbers will tell you that. If you dip first, your growth is almost reassured the following year. And so long as your total package of policies are correct, handle the inflation first and then sustain growth in the long run.
Susan?
Like Dr. Saleh Isfahani, I would say, it depends what you mean by getting the Iranian economy back to a good place. I think that it is quite possible to see growth in the forthcoming year, if only because there was so much retraction over the course of the past year. So there's a good starting point. But we won't see, sort of production levels in key sectors, trade levels, I think, rebounding to 2004 levels for quite some time. And I think ultimately, even these periods of rebound will be difficult to sustain unless you see the kinds of structural reforms. And I think, one of the issues that Dr. Mehran mentioned, the conditions that would actually facilitate the development of a real private sector in Iran, because to me, I think that's one of the most disturbing dimensions of Iranian economic policy over the course of the post-revolutionary experience, which is that even where there has been some devolution from the state, it has really remained, much of the economy remains in the hands of entities and individuals who are closely aligned with and tied to the state. And I think that is deeply problematic for long-term growth.
One more question. Yeah, sure.
Just say one thing.
Please.
What I was saying was, I agree with Dr. Mehran that as an economist, we should never predict. I was just saying whether it's possible or not, whether that's going to happen, no prediction. So I agree with him.
Let me put another question to the three of you. The central bank under President Ahmadinejad was weakened substantially, really. And there was a lot of interference from the government. So did it contribute to this economic situation, in your view? Susan, let's start now with you at that.
Yeah, easy answer. I think yes, and I think that there is reason to believe, you know, it was a profound problem, but there is reason to believe that Rouhani himself and the team that he's put together sort of appreciates that this is a central component in having a well-functioning economy, at least greater autonomy, if not full autonomy.
So what did they do to the central bank in the last 8 years? To neutralize it? Yes. And then I'll go to Hud.
I think if you look at the corporate structure of the central bank, there are some features to consider. For example, the president of the republic is also the chairman of the General Assembly for the central bank, which is the shareholders' meeting of the central bank. Well, it seems to me that it will be very difficult to have a sort of an equal dialogue at that level. If you look at the composition of the Monetary and Credit Council of the central bank, there are 4 ministers there. And of course, their deputies are normally representing them. It is still chaired by the president of the central bank. But it seems to me that if you were to be so responsive to the government at the time, you will not be able to function independently. And most importantly, when I look at the balance sheets of the central bank, you will find that it has really quadrupled. I mean, the dimensions of the increase are enormous. And if the central bank cannot control its own balance sheet, it cannot control the balance sheet of the integration of the banking system. And what has happened to it then, therefore, it created so much liquidity that in itself, it fed into the economy rather than be a constraint on the economy. At the time of the 60s and the 70s, I like to think that we also experienced the same. As I mentioned to you, if there is a fiscal expansion, there is very little you can do to absorb what is spilt over into the economy. And yet you could constrain the rest of the economy if you had a viable private sector. Sometimes it's at the expense of growth of the private sector or non-oil exports, something bound to happen in the process. But you're still able to constrain the overall level of liquidity. And this certainly is not supported by any evidence that this happened in the last few years in Iran.
Well, very well said. The central bank has been weakened, but has been part of the structure, and it's just the question is to what extent the president wants to force some project, or the executive wants to get the central bank to finance its projects. And once they decide to come up with a plan, central bank doesn't have much room for maneuver. And the point also that the private sector is not the real private sector makes it very problematic, because if they have a project which is quasi-private sector, they get their funding much more easily than a truly private sector would have been able to get. The bright side of things is that right now a lot of these problems have been recognized, and not by any change of structure, but by change of consciousness about what the problem is, what needs to be done. And there seems to be much more enlightened debate about these things. And also the central bank governor recently, for example, set a lower bound for the price of the dollar in the market, which was opposed to a lot of people. Similar questions that had risen in the past, that some people want the foreign currency to be cheap so they can import goods, and they're arguing that this will control inflation and everything is going to be fine. Central bank governor argued that no, this is not the right thing, and here's my floor, and set a floor which so far he's held on to his position, and that has actually acted as a floor. Because the euphoria about the agreement with the P5+1 actually brought down the price in the market very sharply, but the central bank's governor's comments and his determination seem to have worked so far. So what may change is not so much the structure and power of the central bank governor institutionally, but more in this way of realizing that this is an important function and monetary policy is important and therefore should be given some leeway.
Okay, Barbara, just wait for the mic, please.
Thank you very much. Barbara Slavin, former scholar here and from the Atlantic Council now. To Suzanne and to Dr. Saleh Isfahani and also Dr. Mehran, if he wants to comment. One of the things we hear is that there's a constituency in Iran for keeping the sanctions, that the current situation is actually benefiting a small and very influential sector of the Revolutionary Guards or some of the bonyads. Could you speak to that? Are there still winners from the current economic situation that might try to interfere with a long-term nuclear deal that would actually lift sanctions? Thanks.
Suzanne, you want to go first?
I'll start, but I'm sure Dr. Saleh Isfahani and Dr. Mehran have a lot more to say on this. There are always people who are winners from bad situations, and I think it's clear that in Iran, given the epic rents that came in over the course of the Ahmadinejad presidency, a lot of people got very rich or became even richer. There's no question, again, this is a very wealthy country, and we shouldn't pretend that even with these sanctions that Iran has been reduced to utter destitution. So I have no doubt that there are organizations and institutions that see some continuing benefit from maintaining the current level of isolation and obstacles to foreign investment and foreign trade. That said, I think that there's a really powerful argument, and I'm sure you would probably agree, that what we've seen in terms of the progress, very quick progress toward an initial deal and apparent goodwill to move to the next stage, is a demonstration that the leadership, in a very aligned consensus fashion, has decided that this is a deal that is needed, and in fact that there is broad-based support for the negotiations, despite the fact that it's Iran. It's a political society. People are going to debate it, and the terms will be contentious. But I genuinely think, and part of it is looking back on some of these prior points of economic crisis where clearly there was a decision made in '88 to end the war, in part because of the economic pressures. Decision made in the mid-1990s, not just to reconstruct, but in fact to offer a deal to an American company as a way to kickstart investment in the oil and gas sector from abroad. And similar decisions made in the late 1990s. So there is a real evidence here, I think, of a government that can in fact make quite rational decisions, that can turn and reverse its course even on contentious and sensitive policies, even where it does hurt influential constituencies. And of course, in all those prior situations, decisions that were made in part because of economic pressure hurt influential constituencies and were imposed by those. So I'm maybe the only bullish person in Washington on the prospects for getting to the final deal, but I think in fact the stars are reasonably well aligned on the Iranian side to make progress.
You want to answer, Hadi?
I agree with a lot of that, and I just want to add that while there are powerful constituencies that are opposed, but there are also a lot of interest and enthusiasm about having a deal with the West, changing the situation. The decline of the economy last year and the high inflation is unprecedented since 1980s, and given the oil money that was flowing in beforehand, there's a lot of resentment. Why did this happen? And as a result, there's an understanding consensus, a big chunk of the society, part of the society that believes their better lives could be out there, and we need to get it. And Rouhani represents those people. Remember that he got a little bit above 51% of the vote, so not everybody agrees. But after election, his message has even become stronger and been accepted much more widely. Still, there are people who oppose him very strongly, but the balance of power seems to me much stronger in his favor.
A question from the overflow. It's on monetary policy. So what are the tools available to revive credit in the economy in the context of very high non-performing loans, 20% of loans, and limited liquidity in the banking system, deposit rates much lower than inflation rate? Hassan?
Yeah, I'm not really that current on the banking situation in Iran, but I have heard this argument that any constraint on credit will affect production. Obviously, could be an instrumental factor in causing recession at the same time that the banks, because of their non-performing loan figures, do not have the capacity to lend. I'm familiar with some figures about the non-performing loans, but as you know, most of at least the major banks in Iran are all government-owned. And one of the articles of the constitution initially was to nationalize all banks. And therefore, the non-government banks and the individual privately owned banks in Iran, how well they're doing vis-a-vis the government banks, I do not know. But given the share of the government banks, it seems to me that, again, that's a matter of fiscal. If there are non-performing loans, you have to capitalize the banks. And that, again, becomes another claim on the government budget. These are owned by the government, Bank Milli, Sepah, etc., the big ones. Of course, I understand that some of the medium-sized banks have also been privatized somewhat, but the government remains the major capital shareholder. And in any organized financial market, the shareholders are ultimately responsible to capitalize the banks. And in Iran, it happens to be the government. So if you want non-performing loans to disappear, you have to capitalize the banks. If you want them to lend, you have to recapitalize the banks.
Sure. The issue of the banking system in Iran is a big one, although it's not just the problem of non-performing loans. In fact, one may argue that even the performing loans could be a problem because they were given at a very low interest rate. It's true. Those who borrowed, they're paying back, but they're just paying back the interest. And because the way they got the money, usually they can get to the terms to be renewed. So they continue to service their debt. But so on the books, they look performing, but the bank doesn't have any resources to lend to somebody else. And sometimes these monies borrowed have not been put to productive use. In fact, a lot of it has gone to buying stocks, so transferring the money abroad, etc. So the banking sector also has been constrained because a lot of the money has been channeled by the government to its own projects. So outside the government sector, there's access to credit is very limited. And to solve that problem, basically, again, goes back to the issue of the government that Dr. Mehran also highlighted. The government has to cut its deficit, its demand on borrowing, and allow part of that money to go to the private sector. Of course, there's, to the extent that there's non-performing loans or the loans that have been made have been highly subsidized, that's come at the cost of the banks, and that they also need to be recapitalized.
Suzanne, you want to add something to it? We had a speaker here last week who had just returned after a 4-month stay in Iran, and she was asked what struck her, in Tehran. And she said the sheer number of banks. She said in her, she had spent most of her life in Iran. She said she had never seen so many banks, sometimes 3 banks in a street. So what does this mean to have so many banks? Huh, Hassan?
I
What
think
does it
maybe
mean?
Mr. Shorakov would have.
So you speak for him.
No, I can't speak for him, but I think maybe he has some observations to make about the number of banks in Iran, because it
Yeah.
just come back and
What does this mean? It's the former governor, the former governor of central bank. What does can you bring a mic, please? Here, Sama, to this gentleman.
Thank you. Well, actually, 60s and 70s, I was in Industrial Development Bank, which was the father of all the industries that today are in place. In fact, auto industry, cement industries, steel industries, they all were built during 60s when Industrial and Development Bank was created. And I was vice president for projects, so all the project went through my office. Not only we found the private sector partners from abroad, but we also helped them find working capital through the banking system, commercial banking system. Since you asked me to make some comment, let me just go ahead and do that. First of all, I think the 6 years of the last year of Shah is equal to the 6 years of Ahmadinejad. I mean, exactly the same. They both wanted to make people happy because Shah saw that the revolution is coming, and therefore he had the farmers happy already by distributing land. He had the workers happy because of distributing shares, expansion of ownership through loan to employees to buy shares of their own companies. And what was left was bizarre because they were both very rich and they were very influential. And they couldn't, and inflation has gone up, and he didn't believe that inflation had caused the increase of prices. He just wouldn't believe that. He couldn't understand that. So what happened is that the Bazaars stood against him and supported the revolution, and then was the revolution. And the same thing happened during Ahmadinejad. I mean, he just didn't understand that you cannot bring the money to the table of everybody's table. They say sofre. I mean, what is it, sofre? A food table. And he just tried to do that. I mean, that was, unfortunately, he had some $700 billion oil revenue over his 8 years of managing the government. And he just wanted to travel over the country, every city, every town, every village, and promise everybody everything. And the same thing happened to him. I mean, there was another revolution. I mean, for Rouhani coming up as a president over 6 conservatives, whom the highest voter didn't even get 1/3 of his vote. That is a revolution. I mean, that's the within the system. So I think that's exactly what happened. Another thing that I like to add, can I go a bit?
1 minute?
further.
Yes.
I think in 1 minute was allowed, so I can add this. I think this effect of sanction is overblown. I think the country which has 17 neighbors, from Afghanistan to Pakistan and 6 Persian Gulf, from Amman, which is a good friend, to Kuwait, which is good friend, to Qatar, who is just neutral, to Saudi, who is the adversary, and then come to Iraq, you go to Turkey, then the neighbor is Azerbaijan, Armenia, Tajikistan. I mean, when you have so many neighbors, I mean, sanction really, how effective it is questionable. There are many people in these countries that can do business without having any business with U.S. I mean, you will be affected if you have business with U.S. So if you don't have business, and there are a lot of small companies set up. It is a bit overblown, I think. Yes, the latest sanction on oil and banking, which really is international, is effect. But again, Iran exports a lot, petrochemical and foodstuff, by barter agreement over 17 neighbors. So, and they get their money one way or another. So that's, I think it's a bit overblown. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Hadi, thanks.
Right. Too many banks, maybe.
Yeah.
There are quite a few banks, some of them called banks, some of them engaging in banking, but not with the same name, and a lot of them not regulated. So there's going to be a shakeup probably down the road. But right now, it seems that the banks that are under control of the central bank or directly regulated, they get a lot of funding and support from the central bank, and they end up passing on money to entities that somehow directly or indirectly are public, belong to the government or quasi-government entities. And that's basically how the system has survived. A lot of banks may be very inefficient in many ways, but so far they're surviving. Bringing down inflation, we might see some shake-up. However, I must add that there's some factors that are helping the multiplicity of the banks right now. One of them is technology that makes them easier to work with each other. As a result, it's not, the number of banks has not caused as much fragmentation as it would have otherwise been the case, because people can easily transfer money between accounts in two different banks. So they're working closely with each other, and that, to me, it seems that reduces the amount of problem that we have with too many banks in Iran. Nevertheless, the current banking, one of the biggest obstacles in the next couple of years as inflation goes down is going to be dealing with the banking system.
Suzanne?
I just make one comment. So I can't document it, but I suspect there is a relationship. But the subsidy reform program that Dr. Saleh Isfahani talked about that effectively required everyone to have a formal bank account, which wasn't necessarily the case before. Certainly, it contributed to the expansion of banks outside of major cities.
But that was only in one bank, Sadarat. But it could have had an effect, probably indirectly, but the government required that account to be in a particular bank.
Hassan, you want to add something? Yes, please. Just wait for the mic. Identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Peter. I'm a student at SAIS. I've heard it said that the sanctions caused, educated middle-class Iranians to stop paying so much attention to politics and turn their attention to economy instead, just trying to kind of stay afloat, and got their attention off of political issues. And so it had sort of maybe a bad effect on human rights, a bad effect on desire for political reform. Is there any truth to that?
Suzanne, you want to take that?
I've heard these arguments made. I've heard arguments made that Ahmadinejad and others contributed to the depoliticization of Iranians, and therefore the failure of the reform movement contributed to the depoliticization of Iranians. You know, one can make a lot of different arguments with respect to why it is that Iranians appeared to be less politically engaged over the course of the 2000s in the aftermath of the Khatami presidency, and suddenly became re-engaged on June 14th. You know, I think that much of the argument has to do with the fact that we only see very episodically this kind of political engagement, and you know, anecdotal expressions of frustration are probably ubiquitous and timeless, in the sense that, you know, you can always find someone who's sick of these bums in any political system. I think that, you know, to me, the sanctions have been a negative for Iranian society, will continue to be a very profound negative for Iranian society in all sorts of ways. And it's something that I think we here in Washington don't have a robust enough discussion about. I remember listening to a very esteemed academic talk about Iraq back in the 1990s, and she was in fact addressing a group of individuals from the Gulf who were, of course, not terribly sympathetic to Iraqi concerns and interests. But she said, you know, someday you're going to be dealing with this population. Someday you're going to need to do business with this country. You're going to need to have political relationships with this country. And what the sort of social and political impacts are of the steady impoverishment, the steady isolation of any country are terribly negative. I think that we here in Washington ought to at least acknowledge that you know, nobody welcomes measures that make it impossible for them to travel, make it difficult for them to trade, hurt their bottom lines. And that extends well beyond the bad guys, as it were. I think the administration is more forthright at this stage in acknowledging these are no longer targeted sanctions, and they do not, despite the sanctions relief package, they still are not targeted sanctions. They are very broadly impacting sanctions. And we will all pay a price for that, as I think have Iranians.
That's a good question, because it does appear that there's a lot more attention to economic issues, economic policy right now compared to the past. In fact, the newspapers, the newspaper with the biggest number sold in the country is Dunyay Iqtisad, the world of economy. And you know, economists are treated like celebrities in Iran, which is kind of rare in most of the world. So that's true. But having said that, I would characterize the change in Iran somewhat differently. It's not that young people have become less political. The view about what the solution is and how to approach the issue have changed. There was a view under Khatami, and Khatami held this view quite strongly, that you need to come up with political reform before you address the economic issues. And his first term as president basically was wasted on this. He didn't get very far, created more tensions. In the second term, he did not talk about the economy, but he did a lot of good policy reforms, which was the foundation for economic growth for most of the 2000s up to 2008. In fact, you know, that was the best period of economic growth in Iran, except for a few years, early 90s, was the really nice extended period of economic growth and basis for a lot more prosperity. That experiment, those changes and experiences have accumulated, and people look at it right now and say, look, you know, we can fix the economy. Political issue is still there, so they're concerned about the politics, but how you go about it and how you deal with it, attitude has changed. Having said that, and also listening to the comments, Dr. Maloney's comments on sanctions, I fully agree that the sanctions have contributed to the decline of the economy, and that has had a message for sure. But the hope that people have, they look at the United States and they're now thinking maybe things are changing, and we're showing our interest in peace and peaceful approach to a lot of differences that we have, and we want to rebuild our economy, rebuild our lives, and basically have normalized things, reduce tension. If they see the sanctions continue and harsher sanctions are imposed, this is going to backfire in a major way, I think. So right now, it's a really good moment to come up with a compromise and solve a lot of the problems. And I think the pressure on the Iranian side is quite strong to come up with some solution to the differences.
We have do you have a question? We have 4 questions, and I'm going to take 2 at a time, and so that you can answer them. The lady here, yes, please. Just wait for the mic. Yeah. Ahmed, to I'm sorry. Sure, after the lady, the 2 here.
Ladies first, I'm
lady.
sorry.
Yeah.
My name is Simon Curtis, or Simin Curtis, as my father calls me. I run the American Middle East Institute, headquartered in Pittsburgh, and our goal is to build greater business, educational, and cultural ties between the United States and the countries of the Middle East. I'm working on a couple of Iranian projects, our institute is, and I guess my question is your prognosis generally positive that that we have come farther than we ever have, and this is a tipping point now, so that this interim agreement is really has let the proverbial genie out of the bottle? And so, are you optimistic about this? Because still, Iran unfortunately has been demonized for 34 plus years, and it's very hard, people in the heartland to think of Iran as, almost like Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's the ignorance that's out there. So I guess my question is, how do you counter that? Even in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, there was a headline in the op-ed that says, "Attack Iran now before it's too late." So, this is the Wall Street Journal. So.
Dr. Karimi,
Excuse me.
just here. Thank you.
Ahmed Karimi at the University of Maryland. This is an opportunistic question since we have a number of expert economists. What's happening to poverty? There was a time before the revolution, where my recollections go, that poverty was visible. It was naked, in the shabby clothes, in the emaciated faces and so on. That face must have changed. It's become less visible, possibly, because of the wealth of the country in general. Or is that true or not? And if so, why is it that we constantly hear, well, everyone is spending so much money in Iran, everybody's fine? I know it's anecdotal, and I know people relate to us anecdotes that they see in northern Tehran, but what is happening overall in the country, villages included, to the problem of poverty?
Let's start with you. No, not even optimism or pessimism. No. I thought the economists are much bolder and would say that. Okay, Susan.
Let me speak mainly to the first question, which is the genie out of the bottle? That's one of my favorite quotes from Akbar Ganji is, he said at least 15 years ago that the genie was out of the bottle. It can never be put back in when it comes to the politics of Iran. And I think on some level, he's probably still right, although, there have been lots of attempts to put the genie back in the bottle. I think we're in a very good place. I think this is a historic moment. I don't think the deal itself is anywhere close to being final. It's going to be a very long and difficult road to get all of the technical arrangements and frankly, politically quite difficult for Iran to make the concessions that are going to be necessary. I believe the political will is there on the Iranian side. Obviously, I think this administration has actually invested very heavily, took advantage of an opportunity that frankly others might not have beginning even before the election, but certainly since the election, to try to get to a diplomatic resolution of this one issue. But of course, as everyone in Washington knows, this is not the only difference between our two governments. I think, you know, we are a lot further away from any full-fledged rapprochement, reestablishment of really comprehensive diplomatic ties. I think remains a much tougher road to hoe. So I'm not optimistic in that respect. I will say that I do think it is a very opportune moment for non-governmental organizations to get involved. I think that's the one place that, for a variety of reasons, both the Iranians and the Americans are eager to facilitate greater contact. The business side of things is much more complicated. But as someone whose first experience in Iran was through a non-governmental organization, taking advantage of an opportunity to try to push the envelope a little and bring Americans back to Iran and bring Iranians back to the U.S., I think you know, really all of those groups out there ought to be trying to make the most of this moment.
Thank you. Poverty?
And poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah, poverty has gone down in Iran very sharply since late 1980s, which it peaked after the war. And I, in fact, did a study recently of looking at the mechanisms that have lowered the poverty rate, what factors were behind it. And it seems that economic growth has helped, but not that much, because economic growth in Iran also has been unequalizing. It helps the rich first and much more. There are a lot of redistributive mechanisms in Iran, like key example is called Comité Imam, the Imam Khomeini Relief Foundation. They identify the poor and make cash transfers and all sorts of supports. And over time, they have become much better at it, trying to be comprehensive, providing comprehensive support to poor families, families that experience adverse shocks. For example, somebody gets sick or the head of the family, the breadwinner dies, etc. They try to target them. There are also other mechanisms, the bureaucracy, the social security system, etc. They all have contributed in some ways, and also government's own expenditure has been targeted more towards the poor. With the subsidy reform, that was a major change in terms of the redistributing towards the poor. Basically, as I mentioned, initially it doubled the income of the poor. The bottom, if you were around 15% of the population or below, your income almost doubled. So that has helped. Now the high inflation, the sanctions, etc., shortages have again increased poverty rates despite the redistribution. But my sense is that the government is very much committed to take care of the poor. When you go to far-flung villages, when you go to neighborhoods that used to be very poor before the revolution, you see a sea change. It's just very different now. A lot of small villages have electricity, roads, access to a lot of infrastructure, and that has helped them a lot. You see also healthcare being reaching far out. So in that sense, they've done relatively well. Ironically, it's really the middle class that has been really badly hurt and has not been getting a whole lot of attention compared to the rest. The rich have done well, or the new rich. The poor have done relatively well compared to the past. It's the middle that seems to be lagging behind, and maybe under Rouhani they will get something too.
You don't want to add anything? Okay, just I'm going to put the last question to you. The relationship between the central bank and the other banks. As
a supervisor?
Yes, as a supervisor, because what is that relationship between the central bank and the other?
If I may make one general comment, namely that not all central banks are also supervisors of the banking systems in their respective countries. And there are combinations of ways in which central banking functions can be distributed among different agencies. In Iran, of course, the two functions are reconciled into one institution and one agency. The problem becomes, I think, in the nature of things that when a number of banking institutions are government-owned, the role of the central bank becomes intertwined with its relations with the government and how much independent judgment can it exercise. And I'm not aware of, knowing the modalities of operations of the current central bank in Iran, to be able to judge it. But I do see that when the entire system or most of the system is owned by the government, you're somewhat constrained as to what to do, because even in terms of classification of loans, you may find that, well, ultimately these are government-owned banks and the government will pay. Therefore, while there may be non-performing loans at this time, but not necessarily anything which will endanger the system. And as you know, the view of a central bank is systemic, namely that the entire system should have the integrity and the soundness that is required. And to the extent that the government remains and its creditworthiness is behind the banks, therefore nothing can go wrong with those banks. I'm saying this not to imply that this is the way in which the central banks do look at it, but I do think that it is in the back of their minds that there is some guarantor, therefore let us be a little bit lenient. Hadi mentioned the question of the Maskan Mehr. If I'm not mistaken, there was a quote that there were about 30% of the entire credit outstanding of the system is gone to this specific housing project for the poor, for those who by definition cannot afford it. And this is a major claim now, if you like, on the central bank, if it is to support and defend the system, certainly eventually on the government budget. If the figures are so large, you find that in fact the fiscal curse, if you like, the centrality of the fiscal operations in a country like Iran has really been embedded within the banking system itself. So the solution is also there.
Any final comment, Hadi or Suzanne? I know there are some questions, but we have run out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Mr. Mehran's book is outside and he'll sign it. ببخشید.
خیلی ممنون.
تشنه که آب
I know.